My grandmother called it a family gathering. That's the exact phrase she used when my mother relayed the message to me in late October. Grandma wants everyone home for Thanksgiving. She's asking about you. Specifically, she's been at. I drove 8 hours from Nashville to Shreveport, Louisiana, on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. 8 hours. With a car full of groceries I'd bought because I knew my grandmother loved sweet potato pie made from scratch, not the kind from a box. I had 2 bags of fresh sweet potatoes in my back seat. I remember that detail clearly because of what happened when I pulled into the driveway. The house was quiet in the way that a house gets quiet when nobody is inside it. Not the soft quiet of people sleeping or watching TV with the volume low. The empty quiet. The lights were off except for the one above the front door that my grandmother always left on for guests. I sat in my car for a moment, confused, and then I walked up to the porch and knocked. My grandmother answered the door. She was in her housecoat, the blue one with the small white flowers she'd had for at least a decade. She looked at me and then looked past me at the driveway, and something moved across her face that I couldn't quite read. "Sweetheart," she said. "Come in." I asked where everyone was. She walked slowly toward the kitchen, one hand trailing along the wall the way she'd started doing since her hip replacement 2 years ago. And she said, "Your mother called this morning. She and your father are staying in Baton Rouge. An extra day, something about a hotel deal your uncle found." I stood in the doorway of her kitchen and looked at the table. 1 placemat, 1 mug already sitting out. "And my brother?" She set the kettle on the stove and didn't answer right away. Then she said, "He went with them." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I looked at the 2 bags of sweet potatoes I'd carried in from the car and set on her counter. I looked at the single placemat on the table. I thought about the 8 hours I'd driven. I thought about the 4 days I'd taken off work. I'm a physical therapist, and taking 4 days off during the holiday week means rescheduling patients, which means paperwork and phone calls and people who are already in pain having to wait longer. "Did they know I was coming today?" I asked. My grandmother poured hot water into her mug and said, "I believe they did." That was all she said. But something in her voice told me she'd known about this before I arrived, and that she had not been the one to plan it. I grew up the second child and the only daughter in a family that ran on an unspoken but very clear hierarchy. My brother, older by 4 years, was the one my parents talked about at dinner parties. He was the one my father coached in baseball and drove to college visits in his junior year of high school. I was the one who helped with dishes, who remembered birthdays, who drove myself to my own college orientation because my parents were at my brother's college orientation. That's same weekend, different schools, same weekend. And nobody seemed to think that was a problem except me. I'd learned not to say anything about it by the time I was 16. Saying something made it worse, made me seem ungrateful, difficult, overly sensitive. So I learned to absorb it, and I got very good at that over the years. I absorbed it all the way through my PT degree, through my first job in Memphis, through the move to Nashville. When a better clinic offered me a position, I called my grandmother every Sunday. I called my parents maybe once a month, when I could manage it, without feeling like I was interrupting something more important. My grandmother and I sat at her kitchen table that first night and ate reheated chicken and dumplings she'd made 2 days before, and she asked me about my patients. And I asked her about her garden. She grew tomatoes every summer, even though her doctor had been telling her for 3 years that bending and kneeling were bad for her hip. She'd grown tomatoes in that garden since before I was born. And she was not going to stop because of a hip. I slept in my old room that night, the same twin bed, the same quilt my great-aunt had made when I was born. I lay there in the dark and thought about sending my mother a text. I drafted several versions in my head. I sent none of them. In the morning, my grandmother was already up when I came downstairs. She'd made biscuits, real ones, rolled and cut, not the pull-apart kind, from a can. I asked her what I could do to help with Thanksgiving dinner, and she handed me a list she had apparently already written. We spent that day cooking together in a way I hadn't done with her in probably 10 years. She showed me how she made her cornbread dressing, which is different from stuffing, she reminded me. And she said it the way she said a lot of things. Gently, but like it mattered. She told me about the woman at her church who'd brought her soup every week when she was recovering from her hip surgery. She told me that her neighbor's son had been helping her with the gutters. At one point, while we were both standing at the counter, her peeling sweet potatoes from my bags because I'd told her why I'd bought them. She said, "You're a good girl, Nadia." I don't know why. That made my throat tighten the way it did. I was 31 years old and I still needed to hear it. "I know this wasn't what you expected when you drove down," she said. "It's okay, Grandma." She looked at me sideways. "It's not, actually." She went back to peeling. "But you're here. And I'm glad you're here." My parents and my brother arrived Thursday morning, about an hour before dinner was ready. My mother came in talking about the hotel pool and a restaurant they'd found downtown, and she hugged me briefly and asked if I'd made the pie. My father shook my hand. He's always been a handshaker, even with his own children. And said, "The house smelled good." My brother said, "Hey," and immediately went to the living room to watch football with the volume at a level that made conversation impossible. Nobody said anything about the day before. Nobody acknowledged that I had been there for 24 hours already, that I had cooked most of what we were about to eat, that I had sat alone with their mother, in a house I'd driven hours gathering that they had quietly withdrawn from, without telling me. I watched my mother serve herself a large piece of the sweet potato pie. She made a sound of approval, a real one, the kind she reserved for food she genuinely liked, and I thought, she doesn't know I made this. She thinks it came from somewhere else or that my grandmother made it. And she didn't ask. After dinner, while my brother and father watched more football, and my mother sat with my grandmother looking at old photographs, I did the dishes. All of them. And while I stood at that sink, with my hands in hot water, I made a quiet decision that I would not keep doing this. Not the dishes specifically, the whole pattern. The absorbing. The weekend passed the way those weekends do, when something unsaid is sitting in the middle of every room. My brother showed my parents something on his phone that made them all laugh. I wasn't included in whatever it was. On Saturday morning, my father mentioned that he and my mother were planning to help my brother put a down payment on a house in the spring. A real amount. My father said something about $40,000 in the way people say things they want you to hear without appearing to announce them. I had 6,000 sutus in savings. I had $48,000 in student loans from my doctorate program. I was not being offered a down payment. I had never been offered anything, really, unless you counted the graduation card with a check for $200 when I finished my undergraduate, which was the same undergraduate degree, which was the same amount they'd given me for high school graduation, and which had not been adjusted for the 7 additional years of school I'd completed since then. I left Sunday afternoon, My grandmother walked me to my car and held both my hands for a moment before I got in. "Come back at Christmas," she said. "Just you. I'll call you directly." I laughed a little. "Okay, Grandma." She squeezed my hands. "I mean it. Just you." I drove back to Nashville, thinking about the way she'd said it. Just you. Like it was something she'd already decided. I came back at Christmas. Just me, like she'd asked. This visit was different from the first minute. My grandmother had set up the guest room properly. Fresh flowers on the dresser, the good towels. She'd bought ingredients for things she knew I liked. On Christmas Eve, we sat in her living room with the tree lit and old records playing on the player she'd had since the 70s, and she told me things she told me before, and she told me things she'd never told me before. She told me about her marriage, which had not been easy. She told me about the years when she and my grandfather had very little money and what it had felt like to build something from nothing. She told me that my grandfather had started a small commercial cleaning company in 1974 with one van and 2 employees, and that by the time he died in 2009, it had grown to a regional operation with contracts. Kraus. Your grandfather sold the business in 2006, she said. 3 years before he passed. He wanted to see it settled while he was still well enough to see it through properly. I didn't ask what it sold for. It felt intrusive. But she told me, anyway. He sold it for $4.1 million, she said. Which was what it was worth then, to the right buyer. And he was careful with it. We paid off everything we owed, helped your parents buy their first house. You might not have known that, and the rest went into the market and into property. She looked at the tree for a moment. I've had a very good financial advisor for 20 years, she said. A woman at my church, actually, who became one when her husband left her with nothing and she decided she'd never be in that position again. She's helped me grow what your grandfather. She's something considerably more than grandfather left into something durably than what he left. I sat very still. I'm telling you this, my grandmother said, because I want you to understand what I've been doing and why. I've been thinking about this for a long time, what I want to leave behind, and who I want to leave it to. She reached over and put her hand over mine. I've watched you for 31 years, she said. I've watched how your family treats you, and I've watched how you handle it. I've watched. You do things without being asked and never ask for anything in return. I've watched you call me every Sunday for 8 years without missing one, even when you were in the middle of your clinical hours and I know you barely had time to breathe. You barely had time. I didn't trust my voice to work correctly, so I said nothing. I changed my will 2 years ago, she said, after my hip surgery, when I had a lot of time sitting in this house to think clearly about things. I want you to know what's in it, because I think you should know, and because I'm not going to be here forever, and I don't want it to be a surprise that turns into a fight before you've had time to grieve. What she told me was this: her estate, which her financial advisor had most recently assessed at approximately $3.8 million in property, investments, and savings, was divided as follows. My parents would receive $150,000 total. My brother would receive $100,000. The remainder, after estate costs and a donation to her church's food pantry that she'd been making annually for 15 years, would pass to me. I did the math slowly. Roughly $3.4 million. I started to cry. I wasn't expecting to, and I couldn't have explained in that moment exactly why I was crying. Whether it was grief for all the years, or relief, or shame, or some combination of all three. My grandmother handed me a tissue from the box on the side table. She kept a tissue box on every side table in her house. I had always loved that about her. Don't feel guilty, she said. I mean that. This is my money and your grandfather's money, and we earned it, and I get to decide where it goes. I've decided. Does anyone else know? I asked. My lawyer knows. My financial advisor knows. And now you know. She looked at me evenly. Your parents don't know the amount of what I have. I've never discussed my finances with them. They know I'm comfortable. But they don't know the specifics, and I'd like to keep it that way while I'm still living. I nodded. I'm not doing this to punish anyone, she said. I want you to understand that. I'm doing this because I believe in rewarding people who show up. You showed up. You've always shown up. We sat there for a while longer with the records playing and the tree lit. She fell asleep in her chair before 10 o'clock the way she usually did, and I turned the volume down on the record player and put a blanket over her legs and sat there in the quiet, thinking about everything. I drove back to Nashville on December 27th. My grandmother called me that Sunday, same as all. She passed away 14 months later, in February, from a stroke. It was fast. Her neighbor called me before anyone else did, because my grandmother had apparently left a note on her kitchen counter with her neighbor's instructions in an emergency, and my name and number was at the top of the list. I flew to Shreveport that afternoon. My parents and my brother arrived the following day. The atmosphere in the house was what you'd expect. Grief, logistics, the particular exhaustion of sudden loss. My mother cried in a real way. Whatever else she was or wasn't, she had loved my grandmother. I believe that. The reading of the will took place at my grandmother's lawyer's office, 11 days after she passed. The lawyer was a man who had known my grandmother for over 20 years, and who had clearly been briefed on the possibility of a difficult meeting. He was gentle but precise. When he read the distribution, my mother made a sound I had never heard her make before. Not a word, a sound. My brother said, "That can't be right." The lawyer explained that it was, in fact, right, and that the will had been drafted and signed and witnessed properly, and that my grandmother had been of sound mind, and had, in fact, reaffirmed her wishes in a signed letter just 8 months before her death, which he produced. My father looked at me. It was a long look. I didn't look away. My brother said several things over the next 20 minutes that I'm not going to repeat here. My mother cried more. My father was quiet in the way that men like him get quiet when they realize that the outcome they expected has simply not materialized. The lawyer asked if there were any procedural questions, and there were none, legally speaking, that had any basis for changing anything. In the weeks that followed, my mother called me 4 times. The calls were a progression. First grief, then confusion, then something edging toward accusation, then a pulling back from the accusation when she apparently realized there was nothing to accuse me of. I hadn't manipulated anyone. I had shown up on Thanksgiving when no one else did. I had come at Christmas when I was asked. I had called every Sunday for 8 years. That was the entirety of what I had done. My brother sent me one text. It said, "Must be nice." I didn't respond. My grandmother's financial advisor helped me connect with an estate attorney in Nashville, and I spent several months learning how to responsibly handle something I had never expected to have. I paid off my student loans in full on a Tuesday morning in May, sitting at my kitchen table in Nashville with a cup of coffee, and I cried again then too. The second time I'd cried about any of this, which felt like the right number. I kept her blue housecoat. It was in her closet, and I asked if I could have it before anything was donated, and nobody objected. I keep it on a hook on the back of my bathroom door. It still smells a little like her, or maybe I just believe it does. I still work at the clinic in Nashville. I like my work, I like my patients. I'm not going anywhere. I still call my parents. Less often than before. But I still call. My mother and I have a different kind of conversation now. More careful. More honest, maybe. My brother and I don't speak much. I'm at peace with that in a way I couldn't have been before. And every Sunday, out of habit and something more than habit, I still pick up the phone at the same time I used to call my grandmother. For a while, I didn't know what to do with that impulse. I'd pick up the phone and then remember. Now I call her neighbor instead. The woman who called me first. She's in her 70s and she lives alone, and she knew my grandmother for 30 years, and we talk for about 20 minutes every Sunday evening, and she always ends the call the same way. She was so proud of you, she says. She told me all the time. I used to say thank you and move on. Now I let it sit for a moment before I respond. I let it actually land. I know, I say. I know she was.